When our oldest daughter was very young, the Christmas nativity scene was just about her favorite thing in the world. She loved to spend hours playing quietly with the various little figures in the creche scene, moving them around the wooden stable, even around the room. If I listened carefully enough, I could hear her little whispers of dialogue between the characters as she played out whatever drama she was imagining. In fact, these stories were so compelling to her that she couldn't confine them merely to the cast of the Nativity. One day I came home from work to find the usual characters surrounded by dinosaurs. I watched before intervening and made out that actually the dinosaurs had come to visit the Holy Family and were there to worship the newborn child. Because she loved the creche scene so much, I thought that this might be a teachable moment. So I brought my then 3-year-old daughter into my lap, and I went through the nativity figures one by one with her and quizzed them about their identity to see how much she understood of the story. "Who's this?" I said. "The donkey," she told me. "And this?" "The sheep," she said. "What about this?" "The cow, the angel, the camels, the wise men, the shepherds, and Mary, the baby Jesus." I was delighted. She understood the nativity story very well, and I pointed to one last character, and she turned to me and said, "You tell me, Dad." You know which character I'm talking about, the one we always forget during Christmas, fatherly pride being what it is. I pressed my daughter. "Are you sure you don't know who this is?" "You tell me, Dad." She needed a hint. "Well, he's very important to the story. He was a carpenter. He was engaged to Mary. He was Jesus' father." Finally, that broke through to her. Her face lit up, and she proudly pronounced to me, "That's Jophus." Years ago, a friend of ours was telling us about the night that his first child was born. He told us that where he was when he found out that his wife's labor had started, about how he had to drop everything he was doing at work to drive home to pick up his wife and bring her to the hospital, how he waited with her through a couple of hours of labor, and then he went back home to sleep while labor continued, and then how 18 hours after the onset of labor, his wife finally gave birth. And at the conclusion of the story, he turned to us and said, "I only got 4 hours of sleep that night." Not a word about his poor wife, 18 hours of labor, just poor me, I only got 4 hours of sleep. And after we heard him say that, silently in our own heads, we were saying to ourselves, "What a Jophus." Nobody wants to hear the father's story when it comes to the birth of a child. It always pales in comparison, because the fact of the matter is, and no matter what Dr. Lamaze might claim, fathers are pretty much useless at the time of birth. Just another Jophus, right? And in our culture today, that doesn't seem to be the only time in which that's the case. When you hear about fathers today, you usually hear about absentee fathers or deadbeat dads. One noted anthropologist recently refused to use the word father. She believes it no longer has any meaning in our present culture. Instead, she refers to the children's mother's husband. You might as well just call him a Jophus, right? And at first glance, the gospel accounts of Jesus' birth might agree. Mary was chosen by God to bear the child. Clearly, Joseph could be considered simply Jesus' mother's husband. In fact, isn't that how Matthew describes him in the genealogy at the beginning of his gospel? Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born, who is called the Messiah. Joseph, the husband of Mary, of whom Jesus was born. In the 4 Gospels, the morning's reading is the only real mention of Joseph, aside from a brief episode in Luke in Jesus' adolescence. The assumption has always been that Joseph must have died before Jesus reached adulthood. That's why we hear so little of him. So in the grand story of salvation that is the birth of Jesus Christ, it seems like he ends up just another Jophus, an extra and pretty much useless observer to extraordinary events. But I wonder, if we read this story more carefully, imagine for a moment what it must have been like for Joseph. Perhaps he was an older man in an arranged marriage to a young woman, not out of love, but out of kindness, out of family obligation to care for this vulnerable young woman, Mary. Or perhaps he was a man who had spent years and years searching for love, hoping for a wife, praying for a child, with many disappointments littering his past. And now, just when his long-held hopes seem to be coming to fruition, he finds out that the woman to whom he's betrothed is expecting a child that is not his own. In the customs of the time, Joseph should have hauled Mary in front of the community, publicly denounced her, divorced her amid great public shame. Mary might even have been stoned to death in the ensuing spectacle. But as Matthew tells us, Joseph was a just man, decided to do the divorcing quietly in private, sparing Mary from public shame and possible fatal outrage. Then something happens. Something happens that makes Joseph's story worth remembering as we think about the great story of salvation. An angel of the Lord appears to him in a dream and advises him to take Mary as his wife. The angel even tells him that he is to name the child, to call the child Yeshua, the Aramaic version of Joshua, the name translated into our language as Jesus, the name that means God saves. Now, in Joseph's time, to name the child was to adopt the child as your own. Some of us older folks remember the incredible image from the TV miniseries Roots, when the African father holds his naked infant baby son up to the clear night sky filled with stars and says, "Kuta kinte, behold the only thing more marvelous than yourself." That's what Joseph does. He holds the baby in his arms. He gives the baby his name. He claims the baby as his very own. He isn't just Jesus' mother's husband. He has a place in the nativity story. He has a purpose in the larger story of salvation. He isn't a Jophus. He is Joseph, the father of Jesus. Some of you are familiar with medical studies that compare the health and development of babies who are held with the health and development of babies that are not. The differences are incredibly dramatic. Babies need the blessing of touch to grow and thrive. They need a Mary. They need a Joseph to take them in their arms. They need a Jesus who cries out, "Let the children come to me," so that he can take them in his arms and bless them. There's an even more basic need present here, as Pam Levin writes in her work on human development. The first message babies receive from those who care for them is this: I see you. You exist. You have a right to be here. I see you. You exist. You have a right to be here. That's what our seeing and touching and holding really communicate. Isn't that what we're saying at any infant baptism? When Nick or Catherine or I hold a little one in our arms, we serve as surrogate Marys and Josephs for a congregation of Marys and Josephs to say, "We see you. You exist. You have every right to be here. How about a little water on your forehead?" Several years ago, Rebecca and her and her partner Julie brought first one son and then another 2 years later to the church that I served for their baptisms. Rebecca is one of the strongest Christians I've ever known. She would send me stories and prayers every week as a way of sharing her faith with me and strengthening my own faith and ministry. It didn't surprise me when I found out that her father was a preacher, that she was a preacher's kid. So as we were planning for her first son's baptism, I asked the logical question, would you like to have your father take part in the baptism? That's when I found out that her father was a preacher in a very conservative Christian denomination. When he found out that his daughter was lesbian, he disowned her. And he instructed all the other members of the family to cut off all communication with her. The message he was trying to give her was loud and clear. I no longer see you. You do not exist. You have no right to be here. There's a name for a father like that. Jophus. Praise God for the church that I served. Even as I held her babies in my arms, the congregation of believers held Rebecca and her partner in their arms, in their loving care. We see you. You and your love exist. You have every right to be here. Though those messages first come to us as babies from the Marys and Josephs in our lives, we never outgrow our need to receive them, to hear them from others. When this time of year one of us pastors visits homebound church members, or when our middle schoolers serenade them with Christmas carols, as they did this past week, when our friends in Christ make their regular visit, the first thing our homebound members do is they proudly show off the poinsettia plant that they received from so many of you as you delivered them this past week. They got the message from us. We see you. You exist. You have every right to be here. Everyone needs to receive that message. Everyone. My cousin Mary and her husband Fotis run a camp outside Athens, Greece, that houses mission trips and youth groups from Greece and from around the world that ministers to immigrant children in Athens. As you well know, Greece is suffering from terrible economic problems. Horrible privation has stricken families. And in a recent Christmas newsletter, Fotis told the story of a woman who was forced to place her 5-year-old daughter in an orphanage just to make sure that she had enough to eat. When the woman went to visit her little daughter, as she was about to leave, the little girl threw her arms around her and cried out, "Mommy, please let me go home with you. I promise I won't be hungry again." It breaks my heart to think of this little girl thinking that it was her fault, that her complaints about an empty belly caused her to be separated from her family. And of course, she isn't the only child around the world facing terrible conditions: hunger, war, abuse, gun violence, abandonment. They compel us to heartbreak on every side, not just in Greece, but in our own nation. That's why so many of us are taking part in the 24-hour vigil on Houdini Plaza beginning at noon tomorrow on Christmas Eve, protesting the U.S. migrant child internment camp in Tornillo, Texas. Just 6 months ago, there were 300 migrant children being held in that U.S. camp. Today, there are more than 3,000 children there. And if we do nothing about it but feel pity and shame, then we are just another Jophus, just another anonymous adult who has made no effort and made no difference. Those kids, far from home, separated from their parents, long to hear what we all long to hear. We see you. You exist. You have every right to be here. Well, here's your challenge for the morning. Who needs you to deliver that message? Who needs you to offer your loving care and attention? Who needs you to open up your arms even as you open up your heart? Who needs you to name the hope of Christmas, that Jesus saves in a world that desperately needs saving? Who needs you to stop being a Jophus and start becoming Joseph? Amen.